being married doesn't guarantee permanence because life still happens. Your partner can still fall out of love with you. You can fall out of love with them. You could fall in love with someone else. So the idea that monogamy contains inherent safety isn't really true, right? It's quite shaky. It feels safer, but it's not actually a guarantee. You're listening to In Bed with Science, a sex podcast. I'm Lee Noren, a sex therapist with a Master of Science in Sexology and over 13 years of coaching, counseling, and therapy experience. Today, we're talking about monogamy versus non-monogamy, and specifically, we're comparing rates of relationship and sexual satisfaction. We're also talking about what actually matters when it comes to being happy and content in your relationship, and when a monogamous couple perhaps shouldn't consider opening up. I've been with my partner for over 10 years now, and when we first met, we had discussions about what we wanted our relationship to look like, and we didn't agree at first on monogamy and whether we should be monogamous. And one of the interesting parts about this is that it led to the kinds of conversations that I hadn't really had in previous relationships, and specifically conversations about boundaries. Not because I hadn't cared about boundaries in the past, but because I'd never been forced by another partner to really define them so explicitly. It was kind of assumed that we had the same idea about monogamy and what that meant. And what I've come to realize, both personally and through my work with clients, is that these conversations are so important, and they're almost as important as the actual relationship structure that we end up choosing. And that's part of why today's study really stood out to me, because it tests something that most of us have been taught and take for granted, that monogamy is the default, and that it's the default because it's what's more satisfying or more stable or more inherently moral for us human beings. But what this large meta-analysis suggests is something much more nuanced, that it's less the structure itself that predicts satisfaction and more about why we choose a specific structure and how well it suits us. Now, what I've seen over the years with clients is sometimes a client will come in and they've been struggling with mismatched desire for years. And it's a kind of situation where one wants more sex and the other partner feels increasingly pressured and stressed to deliver that kind of sex. And at some point, one of the two partners might say, maybe we need to open up our relationship. Maybe monogamy doesn't work for us anymore. And it's brought up as a solution because you're scared of losing one another and of the fact that you might be fundamentally incompatible. So opening up essentially becomes a way to manage that fear, and not necessarily because non-monogamy fits you. And that's why today's study is so important. So today's research paper is Countering the Monogamy Superiority Myth, a meta-analysis of the differences in relationship satisfaction and sexual satisfaction as a function of relationship orientation. Published in the Journal of Sex Research and written by Anderson et al. So the research paper analysed 35 studies and nearly 25,000 people to better understand how our relationship structure, specifically monogamy versus consensual non-monogamy, is associated with sexual and relationship satisfaction. And a quick note here before we get into it, I won't be referring to non-monogamy as consensual non-monogamy moving forward, simply because in my mind, non-monogamy is by default consensual, because if it isn't, it's cheating within a monogamous relationship. So here's what they found. Across all of the studies, there was no significant difference in overall relationship satisfaction between monogamous and non-monogamous individuals. There was no significant difference in sexual satisfaction either. So in other words, non-monogamous and monogamous people are just as satisfied sexually and relationally. And this held true across LGBTQ+ and heterosexual participants, different types of non-monogamy, so things like open relationships, polyamory, swinging, and monogamish setups, and different dimensions of relationship satisfaction, including intimacy, passion, commitment, and trust. There were a few interesting exceptions. So swingers and polyamorous individuals showed slightly higher levels of sexual satisfaction compared to monogamous participants. And monogamish participants, so people who mostly identify as monogamous but have occasional outside experiences, reported slightly higher relationship satisfaction. And interestingly, non-monogamous individuals reported higher trust in their relationships compared to monogamous individuals, though that correlation was small. So what does this all mean? Let's get into it. So what I think the study fundamentally shows is that satisfaction, both relationship and sexual, doesn't come from the relationship form or the structure itself. The important piece is whether you feel like you fit inside the structure you've chosen and how you treat each other within it. And this is where I think our culture has kind of gotten it wrong, because there's still so much stigma around non-monogamy, right? There are so many myths about the kinds of people that choose it and why they choose it, that they're broken, that they're immoral, or that they can't commit, often leading us to conclusions like monogamy is the only inherently ethical way to live. And we are more open today, right? I think we're becoming more and more open. We're talking more about non-monogamy. But most of us still live within that cultural context where lifelong monogamy and marriage and exclusivity is seen as superior. And I think part of why it feels superior is because we've set it up to be. Because when we treat monogamy as morally better, it makes it easier for us to stay inside of it. It reduces that cognitive dissonance of, oh, I find you really attractive, but I'm going to stay with my partner. And it reduces temptation, right? Because it tells us this is the right way. Therefore, I don't even need to look anywhere else. But our sexuality, our desire for other people, our inherent curiosity as human beings over other human beings doesn't necessarily stop just because we've chosen the person we want to be with. And admitting that is really uncomfortable for a lot of us, right? So check in with yourself right now. Even as I'm saying this, does this feel like it's provoking something inside of you? Because the thing is, the minute that you admit that you still notice other people, it's almost like questioning the structure you've built your whole life around, because it opens up this whole can of worms for a lot of us of, well, what if my partner desires someone else? And what if I do? And what does that mean about us? And what does that mean about our commitment? Does it mean we're wrong for each other? Does it mean we need something else? So to deal with the uncertainty that these kinds of questions bring about, we elevate the structure of monogamy. We tell ourselves it's the safest choice. It's the healthiest one. Really, it's not even a question at all. It's just the way we should do things. And that way of relating to monogamy protects us from having to look too closely at the complexity of human relationships and love and desire and sexuality. But if we're being really honest with ourselves, being married doesn't guarantee permanence, because life still happens. Your partner can still fall out of love with you. You can fall out of love with them. You could fall in love with someone else. So the idea that monogamy contains inherent safety isn't really true, right? It's quite shaky. It feels safer, but it's not actually a guarantee, no matter how much we want it to be. Now, a small subsample in the research showed that non-monogamous individuals reported slightly higher trust. And to me, this makes complete sense, because non-monogamy isn't the default in most societies, and this means that we often more naturally then ask the questions about what non-monogamy entails for our partner, as opposed to looking at what we do in monogamous relationships, which is where we often don't have that conversation at all because we feel like we don't need it, right? But when you are operating within a culture where non-monogamy isn't the default, you really have to explicitly define the specifics of the parameters. So if you're allowed to have sex with someone else, what does that mean? Does it include all kinds of sex, right? Can you do whatever you want but not spend the night because nights are reserved for your partner? What about protection and testing for STIs? And can you have sex with others but only when your partner's present? Can you fall in love with someone else but I'm still the primary, I'm the one you come home to? So all of this requires that explicit communication and a clear setting of boundaries. And I think those of us who live monogamously can learn from that, because monogamous relationships also have lots of boundaries. They're just rarely defined or talked about. So we could take flirting as something. So, you might say, yes, we can flirt, or no, we can't. But what does flirting actually constitute? Is flirting dancing with someone else? Is it being extra friendly? Is flirting checking someone out? Or is it having a long charged conversation all evening, but you're never going to touch the other person? Flirting is different for everyone. What we put in that word is different for everyone. And yet, these definitions are often thought of as universal. But when you actually have that conversation, you might realize that you and your partner think very differently about what being faithful actually means and what monogamy means. And by having the conversations, you're actually ensuring that you're setting yourself up for success, because it's those gray areas where we can quite easily overstep without knowing it. So when I look at this trust finding in the study, I read it as, when you define your boundaries really clearly, that's when trust can really form. And you have to trust one another in a different way when you're exploring something that's perhaps new to you and you're having really sensitive conversations. When it came to sexual satisfaction, the overall pattern was the same. So there wasn't really a big difference between those who were monogamous and those who were non-monogamous. In some subgroup analyses, polyamorous relationships and swinging stood out with higher sexual satisfaction. Monogamish and open relationships didn't. And I don't think that there are specific conclusions to draw here, at least I don't draw them myself, other than the fact that, again, the relationship structure itself likely isn't the important thing. It's the fit of the structure, the kind of thing that we've been saying this whole episode. What might be important to consider here, though, when discussing all of these results, is that they are based on self-reported data. And as I've mentioned before, there is this very real stigma around non-monogamy, which means some people might be presenting a rosier picture because they're used to having to defend their relationship. But even with that in mind, the overall takeaway is the relationship form isn't the magic ingredient when it comes to how satisfied you feel sexually. And I think this is really interesting because it brings to mind that sometimes when things are really hard, we look outside of the relationship to fix what's going on inside of it. And sometimes that is questioning the structure of the relationship itself. But what I often see is that satisfaction isn't just about the type of relationship you have, right? So sometimes when I see monogamous couples struggling, specifically sexually, right, where sex is that one thing that you can't have with someone else within monogamy, they might raise that question of whether changing the relationship itself and opening it up can be a way to improve things between them. And sometimes opening up at a time like this can come from a grounded place where you truly believe that part of the issue is that one of you or both of you just doesn't really fit within monogamy, right? And you're both genuinely open to exploring a different way of living. But quite often what I see is that opening up gets raised as this kind of last-ditch effort to save something that really already feels like it's coming apart at the seams. And this makes sense. So let's say you've been struggling with different levels of desire for a long time. One of you wants sex, the other doesn't, and you've been talking about it and arguing. And no matter how hard you try, you feel like you just can't get on the same page about sex. So the thought becomes, okay, well, what if we open up the relationship so that the higher desire partner can get more sex? Maybe that will take the pressure off of me, and maybe that will fix it and they'll be happy. And we can go back to being happy together again. The issue here is that the question is coming from a place of reducing fear. It's more about reducing the fear of being left or reducing the perceived risk of being left for someone else, or that the pressure surrounding sex is something you just need to kind of push away, rather than answering the question of how you can be happy together. And when that's the motivation, we're usually missing something really important. We're bypassing the reasons someone doesn't want sex and the reasons why sex is so important to the other person. We're essentially bypassing the emotional dynamics that are often underpinning the issue at hand. Because opening up doesn't necessarily solve the reasons why sex feels pressured or has become so difficult. It might temporarily relieve that and make you feel like you don't kind of have to be in the mood all of the time, but it doesn't reduce the things or remove the things like pent-up resentment or a power imbalance or feeling like you're not seen and valued for all the other things beyond sex that you bring to the relationship. And it doesn't bring about the closeness that you so often desperately want with your partner, even if there's a lot of resentment maybe masking that initial or kind of underlying desire that you do have. So sometimes opening up at this stage can actually be more running away from the problem than solving it. And the thing is, opening up requires incredibly strong communication. You need trust and you need boundaries, and you need to be able to have those really difficult conversations about deeply uncomfortable subjects like sex that don't turn into blow-ups. And in relationships where things are already volatile and you're both unhappy and you have been for a long time, those kind of conversations can be nearly impossible. So again, this isn't about monogamy being better or non-monogamy being better. It's about why you're choosing to open up and what you think it will give you, not relieve you of, but what it can give you. So, if this study is telling us that monogamy or non-monogamy doesn't necessarily determine satisfaction, then the obvious next question is, well, what does predict satisfaction in a long-term relationship? And the study we're looking at today doesn't look at this directly, but clinically there are lots of different patterns. So the foundations that matter the most to people are of course subjective, but there are quite a few common denominators that research has found and that I've seen clinically. So things like how emotionally safe you feel in your relationship, whether there's a balance of power or whether one person consistently has the upper hand, whether you feel respected and validated and taken seriously, because if you feel like your partner always decides what happens or their needs constantly override yours, they're constantly more important, that's going to erode that sense of worth within yourself. And that tends to show up in satisfaction, both relationally and sexually. It's also about intimacy. How close you feel, how sexually connected you feel. So for some people, those things go hand in hand. For others, they're more separate. But either way, a sense of closeness tends to matter. It's also about things like shared values and feeling listened to, and feeling like your partner wants to understand your inner world, right? Your hopes and your dreams and your fears. And whether you feel like you're building something together and have future plans. It's also about the balance of positive and negative interactions. So are you mostly turning toward one another, or are you mostly criticizing or withdrawing? Are you giving your partner the silent treatment when they bring up an issue? Now, research from the Gottman Institute shows that we need about 5 positive interactions for every 1 negative interaction for a relationship to last. Those things predict satisfaction far more reliably than non-monogamy or monogamy. Another piece of the study that's really important to highlight is the stigma piece, because the whole premise of this paper is the monogamy superiority myth, right? So the idea that culturally we put monogamy on a pedestal and it's seen as more moral, more stable, more serious, and anything outside of it is lesser. And a lot of people in non-monogamy relationships experience this. So a lot of people don't share with colleagues or friends or even family because there's a real risk of judgment of misunderstanding, but also of discrimination. And all of this creates what we call minority stress, that added stress that comes from being part of a group that's marginalized. But here's what's interesting. Despite that minority stress, levels of relationship and sexual satisfaction aren't that different to monogamous relationships. And part of me wonders if one reason why this kind of scrutiny and discrimination doesn't negatively impact levels of satisfaction could be because there's this sort of common enemy outside of the relationship. So if you think about a teenager dating someone their parents doesn't approve of, oftentimes the more parents push back, the stronger the couple bonds, and it turns into this us against the world dynamic. Now, want to be really clear, I'm not saying stigma is a good thing. It's definitely not. But I do wonder whether in some cases, this kind of minority stress can create a more intentional choosing of your partner, and therefore it creates more closeness and togetherness than we might think that scrutiny would create or kind of chip away at. When the outside world questions your relationship, you may have to define it and choose it even more clearly for yourselves. So overall, the study highlights that monogamy isn't superior to non-monogamy. The structure, the relationship form itself, isn't the important piece to determining levels of relationship or sexual satisfaction. So just like with a hobby, if you love football, it's great. If you don't, it's boring or miserable, because football isn't morally superior as a hobby. It's something that suits some people and doesn't suit others. And the way I view relationship structures and what the study is saying here is the same. So if exclusivity and marriage feels like it's aligned with you, then monogamy and marriage can be amazing and work really well. And if autonomy and multiple partners or being able to have sex with whoever you want feels more aligned and more compelling, then non-monogamy likely suits you better. We only have one life, and you deserve to live it the way that you want to. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please consider giving it a 5-star rating in your podcast app. It really helps other people find it. That's it for In Bed with Science. Please remember that everything shared in today's episode is for informational purposes only and isn't a substitute for medical advice or therapy. For personal support, please reach out to a qualified professional. If you're looking to get your desire back and reduce pressure and stress surrounding sex, head to leanoran.com or click on the link in the show notes to learn more about how to work one-to-one with me. Thanks for listening.